Today I'm setting up my reading journal for 2026. My reading journal is going to be very specific to me and my interests, but I have a hunch that it might spark something for others as well, and maybe that's you, so I want to bring you along. I'm coming to this reading journal as both a reader and a writer. I try to write fiction in my free time, the small amount of free time that I do have. It's something I've always been interested in and always wanted to try my hand at, and actually in my 20s, as a lover of stories and books, I decided to pursue an MFA in creative writing, so it's for sure been a long-term interest of mine. And through my own study of writing and fiction writing in particular, I've come to subscribe to the very commonly held belief that the best writers are first and foremost readers, and that really to learn how to write, the first thing you have to do is read, and read deeply and widely. I want to create a reading journal practice that helps me tap into my reading in support of my interest in writing. And I think that maybe that makes my approach to this and my ideas for this reading journal a little bit different than other reading journals I've seen out there. I have a bad track record when it comes to keeping up with reading journals, but I still want to share what I'm playing around with here, not because I think anyone would or should replicate any of this exactly, but again, because I think it might spark some ideas for folks out there, whether or not you're a writer yourself. I think any passionate reader might find something to take away here, and also I think there's just a general trend of readers being interested in other readers' reading habits. We love to know how other people organize their reading lives. I'm not sure why, but we all do, me included. I don't know if it's just to get ideas for ourselves or because we are all eager to be judgmental. Please feel free to judge anything you see here. You have my blessing, have at it. This is not a video for readers who want to create colorful spreads with drawings and calligraphy and cutouts and collages. There are so many talented creators out there who have tutorials for that kind of thing. This is not a video for readers who are interested in tracking stats and goals and TBRs and star ratings. Again, there are many talented creators out there who have created videos covering just that. This is also not a video for readers who are interested in researching a specific subject. I do research as a fiction writer. I record that research somewhere else. This is not a journal for research. And again, there are so many talented creators out there who can tell you exactly how to take notes on your research. My journal will be the place for me to reflect on the books that I've read over the course of the year, with a focus on the craft choices that an author makes in their work, and specific focus on those craft choices that I am most interested in right now. These are craft elements in writing that I am most excited about continuously over my reading life. They're also craft choices that I'm struggling with in my own writing right now. We'll get to all of that in a moment. We'll get to what exactly I'm going to be looking for in specifically the fiction that I'm reading this year, but let's just jump in and get started. So you're going to need a journal. I like brands that come in lots of pretty colors like this one. I also like that this has a pocket at the back and page numbers too, but please use any journal you have lying around. You also need a writing utensil. I pretty much write exclusively with Ticonderoga No. 2 pencils, but I used this for my reading journal last year and found I was getting annoyed by sharpening and the smudging that was going on. I really do only use pencil when I take annotations in my books, but I think for this reading journal, I will be switching to the, drumroll please, Bic pen. I am certainly someone who's spent my own share of money on fancy pens and markers in the past, and I find that really the good old-fashioned Bic pen is hard to beat for me personally, but please do use any writing utensil you would like. You're also going to need, if you want to follow this approach, a loose sheet of paper of some sort. I here clearly am using an index card. Any old paper will do. This is going to fit into the pocket at the back of my journal, but anything that'll slip into the journal
Whether you fold it or not is fine. I often will use pretty greeting cards for note-taking, like within my books, because I like pretty things. But for now, I'm just going to be using this index card, and you will see why in a moment. And that is it. That is our list of tools needed. You obviously will need some books to read, clearly, which we also have. Once you have your tools, the first step is actually the trickiest step, at least in my experience, and that is finding a balance between planning your journal and starting your journal. I could plan forever, but at some point you have to just start writing in the damn journal. So I, this year, gave myself a deadline. I had until I finished my first book of the year. The first book completed in 2026. That's the amount of time I had to figure out exactly what I wanted to record in the journal. And here's that book. Actually, I'm not quite done with it yet. I'm getting close to the end. This is going to be the first book that I finish, Heaven and Hell by Jan Kalman Stephenson, and it's published by Biblioasis. This is an Icelandic author who I read a book from him last year and really loved it, and I'm loving this book as well. So I think this has two benefits to set this kind of a deadline for myself. One, it gives me a deadline, obviously, which is helpful, but also while I was reading this, knowing that I was going to be setting up some sort of reading journal towards the end of finishing this book, it helped me figure out what I'm actually interested in reflecting on within the journal. It helped me orient myself. Helped orient me to my reading year ahead. And so as I was reading this book, I was really thinking a lot about what I wanted to record and what I was most likely to keep up with. And so I found it really helpful to actually start reading first and then start thinking about the reading journal. So let's start setting up this journal using this as the first entry. We're not going to fill out everything because I haven't quite finished it yet, but we're going to use it to get us started. Okay, well, and I just put lotion on, so there we go. Okay, cap off. Cap off. Do you all use pens to open shrink wrap stuff? I do. Here we go. Actually, I want to use black. I am going to be a little picky. Literally just put lotion on so that I would be all lotioned up for you guys. Okay, downside of big pens. Blue it is. Oh my Lord. Stickers for the side if you want to label. So let's start setting this up. This is the first section. I'm going to go back and fill in the table of contents later once I have all my sections. The first section here is going to be the list of books I read in order of completion within 2026. Title only. And then as I fill it out, I'll go back in and add the page numbers of where each journal entry for each book starts. I'm kind of superstitious and feel like writing the book down before I've actually finished it is just tempting fate that I will not finish it, but we're gonna not worry about that. So next up is really, section 2 is really going to be the only thing in this journal that comes close to tracking goals. And it's not really a goal, but it is something that I do want to track over the course of the year. And that is listing the publishers I've read from in 2026. And then if I read more than one book from a publisher, I'll just add a hash mark next to the publisher's name when I read another book from them. Basically, I want to make sure I'm reading from not just a few select favorite presses. By the way, I only read books from indie and nonprofit publishers on this channel. In case you're new here, I do that because I want to be a resource for people who are interested in small presses, not because I think anyone else should only read from small presses, but only because I want to serve as a resource for people who want to know more about them. So I do want to make sure that because I want to have a nice, wide knowledge of what's being published by small presses, I just want to make sure that I'm reading from lots of them. So I'm going to track that. And this is, like I said, published by Biblioasis, which is a great Canadian publisher, one of my favorites. The next section is going to be where I start recording notes on each book. So this will be the biggest section of the journal, and every book as I complete it, if I feel it's worthy of inclusion, I'm not going to worry about books that I don't think I have anything to learn from or take anything away from. But most of the books I read, I do have things that things that I take away from them. So most of the books I read will be in this journal, not all. So first up in this section will be kind of the bio details of each book. Fairly standard. So I'm going to include the title, author, translator, publisher, the year published by that publisher that I'm reading from, and then also the original year it was published, and if it's a translated book, the original language. You might have other things that you track. Those are mine. So those are my bio details. So next up, I'll write, and I'm not gonna do it now, but I'll write a 2-sentence summary, something that I can write very quickly just to jog my memory in the future of what the key details of the book were about. And then maybe important award details like a Nobel Prize author, Booker Prize. This author was shortlisted last year for the Republic of Consciousness Prize, that kind of stuff. So I will leave a place for a quick summary. I also like to record the themes that I notice in the book. So, okay, I did not leave myself much room for this summary. It'll be okay. Everything's going to be fine. Themes. So themes in this book are death, grief, friendship. There's going to be more once I finish it, but just off the top of my head, Iceland itself, literature, and kind of love of reading. And then down here is where I'm not going to do it for this book right now, but I'll just do it here so you can see where I'm going to record it. So down here, I want to record projects. So these are going to be any projects that I think this book might help me with. This could be writing projects or YouTube projects. If this has a style or craft choices or something that I think will help me think through some of my own fiction writing, or if this is part of a bigger YouTube project that I'm working on, then I want to list them here, but I want it kind of pulled out in its own box so I can scan quickly through the journal and find anything. So basic details of the book. The next section, which is the bulk of the entry, is where I need flexibility. So there are certain craft-focused elements that I want to actively notice in my reading. Elements that I can point to on the page and ask, how did this work? How did this work here? How did this author make this work? But not every book is going to do something notable with every element that I'm interested in. So I can't create a template for every book review that lists, okay, how did this book deal with this? How did the book deal with that? But I do want to remember what I'm looking out for while I'm reading. So first, I want to tell you the kind of elements I'm looking for, and then I'll tell you my solution. So I have several craft elements that I'm interested in thinking about in 2026, and I'll start with the first 4 craft elements. There are 2 of these are things that I always love to think about as I'm reading, and the second 2 are things that I'm actively working on and want to learn about and want to get better at myself. So the first one that I'm always looking at and love to notice, love to think about in any work of fiction that I'm reading. It's actually a group of elements. So point of view, perspective, voice, and narration. And these 4 things working collectively are my number 1 interest in any work of fiction. So point of view is who is doing the storytelling, where the camera is, who's holding the camera, whose mind do we have access to. Perspective is more of the orientation of that mind we're seeing the world through. How does that mind understand the world? What is that character's beliefs and blind spots, stuff like that. And then voice is more how the storyteller sounds as they're telling the story. My favorite examples are recently are like Lesser Ruins. I felt like the voice in that, by Mark Haber, the voice in that is so unique and compelling and drives that novel forward. And really it's a very specific sound that storyteller, that character, that narrator has as they're telling the story. So that's what I think of when I think of voice. And it's all these elements of language coming together: rhythm, diction, humor, self-deception, all kind of create a voice. And then narration is kind of, I think of it as like the authority of how the material is organized, what gets presented to us, what gets left out. I don't know if my understanding of like those 4 elements is a perfect understanding, but that's kind of how I think of each of them. And to me, together, they are the essence of storytelling. They are the essence of fiction. I find them both fascinating, but also sometimes a little confusing to parse out how all of those elements all work together to create a successful novel or a successful story. And so I am always, always, always looking at them whenever I'm reading. I'm also obsessed with openings of novels and short stories. And I had a great class recently, a novel writing class, where our instructor, who's an incredible novelist herself, shared that openings are really what set up the rules for the rest of the story. And I, for example, love when an opening tells you exactly what's going to happen by the end, but you don't know it until you get to the end. And then you get to the end, flip back to the beginning, and you're like, oh yeah, that told me exactly what was going to happen by the end. I love that. I love when an opening grips you right away. I love when an opening makes you laugh, makes you, confuses you even. For example, Heaven and Hell opens, "This was during the years when we were surely still alive." Who's we? Why are you dead now? What years are we talking about here? It doesn't have to be just the first sentence, but like the first paragraph, really. Endings I'm less interested in, but of course, powerful, perfect ending is maybe more rare and maybe more memorable than a great beginning. And I think my favorite books and stories are usually the books and stories with incredible endings. So maybe I'll add endings to the list at some point. But for now, openings are, I think, where it's at. And then 2 other elements that I want to work on myself. One is rhythm. I'm really interested in rhythm and various choices that impact the rhythm of language on a page, syntax, punctuation, repetition, sentence length, paragraph length. I think it's always something I work towards in my own writing, like creating a rhythm, but never consciously. I rework a paragraph forever and forever and forever until it flows right, until it feels right. I'd like to have a better handle on the mechanics of that. Maybe I'll discover that it really is just a feeling, but I would love to understand kind of the mechanics of how to control rhythm of a sentence, of a paragraph. So I want to notice how other writers are doing it. And then finally, the last of these kind of craft-oriented elements that I want to look for is something called the request moment. And this is something that's defined by the writer Charles Baxter in a lecture that you can actually find on Grey Wolf's website. I'll link to it below. A request moment is when a character is asked to do something by someone else. And as you know, it's exactly what it sounds like. But how that request plays out through the rest of the story or novel has huge consequences. It can reveal power dynamics. It can incite conflict. It can build tension. I thought about including, instead of this, something about tracking conflict or desire, tracking what each story's protagonist wants, which is something, what does your character want? That's something you always see as advice, telling aspiring writers they need to figure out. What does your character want? But I think this idea of the request moment is a little bit more interesting. It's a little more focused. So I'm going to be looking for request moments and how they play out over the course of novels and stories as I read this year. And again, I highly encourage you to check out that lecture from Charles Baxter. It's really interesting. So if any of this appeals to you, I encourage you to think of your own set of craft elements that you maybe want to reflect on, maybe not for the whole year, but maybe for like the next 5 books, the next 10 books, see what you find. I created a big but not at all comprehensive list that you can browse and choose from if you're interested. And I'll link to that list below. But that's not the only thing I'm looking for this year. I have a few other things I'm interested in, specifically some motifs and themes that are on my mind recently that I'm going to add to kind of the things I'm on a lookout for that aren't going to be in every single book, but that I want to note and I want to take notes on if they do come up. So the first one is fire. I have been playing around with fire in some of my writing recently, and it can be really, it can be a real cliche. It can be tricky to control fire in a story, but it's used all the time in fiction. It's used as a symbol of purifying something, or it's used as a symbol of destruction. It can be an omen. It can be an end. I feel like a lot of fiction ends on a fire, something burning down. It can be a trial a character must endure. It can be the climax of a story. So I want to start tracking fire within fiction as I'm reading. I'm also really interested in madness that is either temporary in a character or as it starts to develop in a character over time. That's something I'm going to be looking at. I'm also looking for manipulation between characters within fiction, specifically how it builds over the course of a story, how it's used to build tension, how it's used to drive the plot and character development. So manipulation from one character to another is something I'm really interested in. And then I have a few others that I'm playing around with. Actually, not a few others. I had a huge list of these other themes and motifs that I wanted to look for. I whittled it down to these 3. I might add things as I go on this year. But again, I'm going to put my big long list of all the fun things I wanted to look out for in the link below. So you can look through things like storms. Storms are used a lot in fiction, which would be fun to track. There are writers who have made whole books out of tracking this stuff. There are 2 examples, both from Coffeehouse Press. There's a book called The Nature Book, where Tom Comita took just mentions of nature from like 200 books and plopped these nature paragraphs, scenes with nature that had no mention of humans, and built a novel out of it. So there's no humans in this novel. And then Danielle Dutton has a book where she records instances of dresses, like the clothing item, dresses, being worn by characters. And she collected them and added them as a whole section in her recent book published by Coffeehouse Press. It's fun to track this kind of stuff, smells. Smells was one I was thinking of tracking because I feel like that's an underutilized sense that's used by writers, or especially less experienced writers don't think about how a scene or something smells and might leave that out. And so I thought it'd be fun to kind of track all of the smells that come up in what I'm reading. It would be interesting to see. So finally, there's one more thing that I want to track at the book level on these pages that are just about the specific book. And that's something I'm calling no-nos. So no-nos are things an author has done that I do not want to bring into my own writing, things that I don't think worked well, and I want to make sure that I try not to do. Again, it's just a matter of my own opinion. Obviously, some other people might like the things that I point out as no-nos, but those are elements like, for example, I feel like in Heaven and Hell, there are just moments where it's just a little too earnest, where it's just a little too, feels like it's trying too hard. What would be an example? Well, I can't find any here on the spot, so maybe that means it's not as prevalent as I thought as I was reading it. But basically, I just want to track things that I think maybe are worth avoiding in writing. I think that'll be useful for me going forward, and also just interesting. Not every book is perfect, and that's actually something that I love about certain books. I love when a book is not perfect. I don't think perfect books are particularly interesting. Perfect books, like highly polished books. I don't find them interesting. So I think tracking no-nos is a good way to figure out what I want to avoid, but also it adds interest for me for a book when there's something that just isn't quite right. Okay, so what's my solution for tracking these things? So that's where the index card comes in. This is where I'm going to write all of the things I'm most interested in, at least for now, for this first part of the year. And I'm going to keep it right here in the back of the journal and refer to it as I'm writing my little reflection on each book. So let's do that now. So these are the things I want to notice as I'm reading, at least in the first part of the year. And I can always update this. I can always change this. I can always get a new index card from the stack and change what I want to notice in what I'm reading as my interests evolve and change. But that's not all I'm going to do and track here in this reading journal. I did something fun. This is my journal from my reading for the Republic of Consciousness Prize. I was on the jury this past year for 2025. Still am on the jury. And I did little reflections on each and every book that was nominated for the prize. There were 45 books. And I decided it would be fun. I wanted to enjoy the process as much as possible because it was such an honor and such a unique experience. I wanted to kind of do something fun. So I picked a few things to kind of write down and track kind of together from each of the 45 books, but in a way that it wasn't tied back to the book. So things that I was tracking, but not noting what book it was from. So for example, I wrote down all of the epigraphs that were in any of the nominated books and collected them together. And then reading through them has been so fun to see what authors they're kind of picking from and what they're trying to say and trying to remember what book they were. It's a fun thing to try to remember what book they were attached to. Because I write them down in order and I had written, I can always go back and figure out who the epigraphs are from because they're all in order of when I read them. So if I was ever compelled to figure it out, I could go back and do that. So that was fun to track. I also tracked first sentences, which was even more fun. As I have shared already, I love an opening. I love a first sentence. And so, the first sentences are really so fun to read through. The good ones are so good. One of my favorites for some reason, this is from the novel Porthole. I will not apologize, I told my driver, but my favorite is probably from The Endless Week. It's the first sentence is, a head doesn't just fall off, it can't fall off. There were other things that I tracked less successfully. Well, this one was fun. Settings, places visited, and I think I want to do that again this year. All the places, and it got tricky with the short stories because I wasn't writing down every setting of every short story. But I think it would be more fun if they were not in a list, but scattered around. And I kind of filled them in, haphazardly across the page. But so these are most of the settings of all the books that I read from in the prize. So I think I want to do that again this year. I did character first names. Again, that got tricky when, I thought it would be fun to just go back and see, there was an Oren and a Lena and a Malcolm and a Gabriella. I thought it would be fun to go back and look at all the character names from all the books that I read. But that, again, got really tricky with the short stories because I wasn't going to come here and write down every character and every short story from all the collections. So it's not a thorough list. I wanted to start because I was noticing these weird connections between books, especially in the first couple. There were a bunch that had a mental health facility or an asylum and war veterans and muteness and bodies of water and drowning. So lots of these connections between the books, but it got too much. And so I clearly stopped tracking them. Let me skip one. This one I loved tracking themes. And I kind of went back and checked a little bit to make sure I wasn't repeating any. But I mean, look at all these like themes that come up in these books. It's so fun to see everything you read about in a year, all the themes. And then something I've been doing kind of casually in books that I read is looking, once I finish the book, I go back and I look and see what the first word was. And then I go and I look at what the last word was. And I think it's just fun, Little Blue, Last Earth. I think sometimes they can be fun. Sometimes they're boring. Like, She Great. So I don't know if I'll track that in my journal this year, but it's an idea for you. Lots of fun things to track. I think I'm this year going to track first sentences again, places visited, and themes also. So towards the end of the journal, that's what I'll set up a page just like I did here, where as I finish each book in order that I completed them, I'll just write the first sentences and flip through at the end of the year and enjoy how every book I read that year opened. There was one sentence that was went on for several pages, so I just cut it off at some point, a point that made sense. I said, okay, that's enough. So that's it. I hope you found something that inspired you, something you might experiment with. I'll come back, and share my progress as things are actually starting to be filled out and actually look fun and interesting, and share with you how it's going. But I hope that even if you don't try any of these things exactly, maybe this gave you an idea for something different that you want to try yourself this year. If you do keep a reading journal, it doesn't have to be a journal. As I mentioned, I often will take a blank greeting card and I'll use it as a bookmark. I don't have it for this one here because I have my favorite bookstores bookmark in here. But I will often use a greeting card as a bookmark and record my notes. You could have something like that where you track the kind of things that you're on the lookout for, the kind of things you want to actively notice in your reading. Do that actually within a little card in the book. Or, sometimes I do like I do here, I flip to the last blank page and record there. My annotations are pretty minimal. I usually just underline and heart and star as I'm reading because I like to stay within the flow of my reading. But every once in a while, I'll just flip to the greeting card if I'm using that, or I'll flip to the back and take some notes to return to once I finish the book. So thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you are doing well. Again, my name is Sarah, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye.